Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. It's your one-stop shop to take stock of all the developments on the political and literal battlefields. Let's go ahead now and get started. We start off this week with a review of the most important events of the past week, straight from Ukraine.
The deadline for men of mobilization age in Ukraine to provide their personal information to the military passed this week. Long lines of Ukrainian men were seen queuing in front of administrative services centers. The new mobilization regulations were adopted in Ukraine back in May. They aim to address the shortage of Ukrainian soldiers fighting against Russian forces. Men between the ages of 18 and 60 were required to provide their address and other personal information to the military within the given time frame. However, many military-aged men refused to register their personal information as they did not want to be sent into battle. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry has announced that around 4 million people completed the registration as of Sunday. On Monday, President Zelensky confirmed that troop mobilization plans are proceeding smoothly. Ukrainian men liable for military service who failed to provide their data before the deadline may be fined up to $600 or even put on a wanted list. Ukraine has signed long-term security deals with the Czech Republic and Slovenia. The 10-year bilateral security agreements were signed at the 4th European Political Community Summit in the UK on July 18th. More such deals are expected to be signed in the near future. The Czech Republic and Ukraine are expected to enhance their cooperation when it comes to military technology. This includes the production of ammunition and small arms, as well as drones, investments in electronic warfare, and heavy equipment. According to the agreement, Slovenia will allocate an additional €5 million to support Ukraine's humanitarian aid and economic recovery. 23 other countries have also signed similar bilateral deals to help Kyiv, including the US, the UK, Germany, and France. Kyiv's leading children's hospital has partially resumed providing medical services after it suffered extensive damage in a Russian missile attack on July 8th. Thousands of volunteers have been working tirelessly to clear the hospital so it can eventually fully reopen. Aside from clearing the rubble, the volunteers have also been collecting aid, and those unable to help in person send donations to help rebuild the facility. The estimated cost of this undertaking is valued at around $10 million. This entire effort is meant to make it operational again for Ukrainian children in need. Some heavy equipment is also being used to clear debris on the hospital grounds. 94 children were transferred to other Kyiv hospitals to continue their treatment in the attack's aftermath. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on Friday, a day after the European Political Community Summit. Zelensky is the first foreign leader to be invited to Downing Street ever since Keir Starmer became Prime Minister earlier in July. Allegedly, Zelensky asked Starmer to show his leadership in helping Ukraine conduct long-range strikes inside Russia. The UK has previously provided Ukraine with Storm Shadow missiles that have reportedly been used to hit military targets in Russian-occupied Crimea. Earlier in July, Starmer said that how the British missiles are used is up to Ukraine, but that they should be used in accordance with international humanitarian law and for defensive purposes. Recently, the UK announced sanctions on 11 more tankers that help Russia carry oil to third countries, which have been used to bypass Western sanctions and continue the Russian oil trade. This Friday, the British government confirmed that London's call to action against the Shadow Fleet has been endorsed by the EU and 44 individual European countries.
Now let's go ahead and discuss the situation along the front lines. Ukrainian forces continue targeting Russian air defense systems in occupied Ukraine and in Russia's border areas to set the conditions to field F-16 fighter jets following their anticipated summer-fall 2024 arrival in Ukraine. according to the Institute for the Study of War. Now, General Christopher Cavoli, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, has said, and I quote, "The Ukrainians right now, for these past few months, have been focused on defending what they have in the east, denying Russia's free use of Crimea and southern Ukraine to attack Ukraine, and preserving their access to the Black Sea and generating force. So I think they have a great strategy." Cavoli also said a key part of Ukraine's force generation now depends on the EU and NATO. That's going to require us to generate and produce more equipment than we were contemplating perhaps 2 years ago. With that said, now let's look at some of the hotspots along the front lines, and we start up in the Kharkiv region near Vovchansk. Now, according to the latest maps on Deep State, the situation around Vovchansk and Hilboka looks somewhat better. There's an increased area of a gray zone, which means that the Russian forces have been pushed back rather significantly compared to the height of these battles that have been taking place for quite a while now. Now, according to the most recent map on Deep State, it looks like the Russians are still trying to now counterattack to retake the center of Vovchansk, although with very limited gains there. Now, the situation down near Kupiansk, which is just off over here, which you don't have a map of, also very limited gains, and it is near Pishchane, or southern Pishchane, where the Russians have pushed forward actually quite a bit. Let's go down and look at the situation down near Chasiv Yar, which has also been an important battle and a very hot spot. Of course, the area around Avdiivka as well. So in Chasiv Yar, Russians seem to have taken Kalinivka, and that's west of Bogdanivka. Actually quite significant gain if that is indeed the case. This is all according to Deep State maps. The other big hotspot is the city of Toretsk, which has been severely damaged, and Russians continue to encroach upon the city of New York, which is just down here. And the other area is west of Avdiivka, which the Russians keep trying to push on and get access to the control of the road, of course, connecting Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. Beyond that, most reports from the Institute of the Study of War say Russians have made very limited gains in the past week or so. So we can bind that together with the information that we have from the Allied Supreme Commander, General Cavoli, and take this to mean that a strategy has been developed, and hopefully we can see Ukraine start to enter, if not counteroffensive operations in the near future, when it acquires better capabilities, but perhaps be in a position to begin to take some land back. Germany plans to cut in half its military funding for Ukraine in 2025. The country's finance minister, Christian Lindner, said the reason for the move is the increase in funding for Kyiv planned by the European Union. Others say this is just a matter of accounting within the German federal budget and nothing more, while admitting that the messaging is bad and untimely.
Starting 2025, Ukraine will receive €4 billion less from Berlin, given the country's depleted military stocks. As of now, Germany has donated 3 Patriot air defense systems to Kyiv, which is more than any other country. This, combined with US military aid to Ukraine being put into question in the context of the upcoming presidential election, has raised alarms in Kyiv. There is, however, one more entity that could and plans to step up if funding to Ukraine is lacking. The European Union and its recently elected parliament said their support for Ukraine is unwavering. Just this week, the EU approved another transfer of funds to Kyiv as part of the Ukraine Facility project, worth around €4.2 billion.
No one wants peace more than the people of Ukraine, a just and lasting peace for a free and independent country. And Europe will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. This is our message.
This brings the total amount of money transferred to Kyiv through this project to €12 billion. The EU is also reportedly preparing to announce a bill that would make the $50 billion loan to Ukraine a reality. The loan would be facilitated by profits from frozen Russian assets, just as G7 leaders proposed in early June. With all of these revenue streams, combined with the most recent US aid package worth $61 billion, as well as military equipment donations, funding for Ukraine's war effort should be taken care of for the foreseeable future.
And now I'd like to welcome to the program Stephen Nix from the International Republican Institute. Hello, sir, and
thank you for having me.
Yes, it's great to have you. So as we look in the political climate in Europe, especially after the conclusion of the Republican National Convention and the announcement of J.D. Vance for Trump's vice president, we look to see here in Europe, leaders are scrambling to come up with contingency plans in the event that that happens and what that will look like. Now, I know we can only speculate as to what the Trump administration and the Vice President J.D. Vance, if they're elected, will do. But I guess to start off here, will Europe be able to fill the gap and be able to take care of its own military funding and security, as well as fill the gap for the United States in Ukraine?
Sure. Well, first, in response to your question, I would say it is very early, I agree with you, to speculate on what might happen. We still have months to go before the U.S. election. There's uncertainty about who might be the candidate on one particular side. So a lot of uncertainty going into this. But I would say that the remarks at the convention by former President Trump were encouraging. He said last night that the United States will be respected again. And he said, no nation will question our power. To me, that signals an attempt to be very tough with the Kremlin and with President Putin. He went on to say that, in his opinion, the war in Ukraine would not have ever begun had he been president. Again, a clear signal, I believe, that he would have been tough on Putin and prevented this war. Nonetheless, we're now in this situation. We have a ticket on the Republican side. You mentioned Vice President candidate J.D. Vance. I would just say this, that under President Trump, Vice President Pence implemented the policies of the president. And that will certainly be the case in the event that this ticket is elected, that Vice President Vance would implement the policies of a President Trump. So I wouldn't really speculate or take into too much consideration things that have been said recently or during the campaign period. I would look towards a policy that would be set by a prospective Trump administration and by President Trump himself.
Right. Now, J.D. Vance has come quite a way since the full-scale invasion in February of 2022. He makes some pretty compelling points, like the United States can't take care of every place in the world. It can't secure Israel. It can't take care of Taiwan and Europe here and Ukraine all at the same time. Does he have a point there, or is he wrong? What's your opinion on that?
I would counter that, again, when China comes up, one cannot distinguish between China and Russia. Those two countries are engaged in a very strong strategic partnership that both leaders have claimed they want to make stronger. So again, one cannot extricate China from Russia, and nor the opposite, Russia from China. So again, I think the United States has to focus on what is not just a dual threat, but a singular threat presented by the coalition of these two anti-democratic, anti-Western countries. And I think that's exactly what a Biden administration would do if reelected. I think that's what a Trump administration would do if elected.
President Trump actually said something very interesting during the debates. I think he was quite reserved in those debates, and he didn't say anything really truly outlandish when it comes to Ukraine. He also said that he wants both sides to sit down and negotiate in good faith. It's hard to imagine that Russia will do so. So in that event, would President Trump be compelled to back Ukraine?
Well, I certainly believe so and hope so. President Putin is not interested in a negotiated settlement. His plan is to continue to invade further into Ukraine, which is why the U.S. and Europe have to step in and stop him. And we've been spending a great deal of time talking about a presidential administration in the U.S. I would note that the role of our Congress, for your viewers to understand, in foreign policy is very, very important. And you saw that Congress did vote for a $61 billion supplemental for Ukraine. That supplemental will run out sometime early in the new year. So Congress will again deal with another supplemental. My view is there is strong bipartisan support for Ukraine. That will continue regardless of which party controls Congress after the November election. So very encouraging. Speaker Johnson has been very out front, very strong in support of Ukraine since the vote of the supplemental. Wants the U.S. to allow Ukraine to strike deep into Russia on all fronts with U.S. weapons. So taking a very strong approach. So he's going to provide leadership in the event that he continues to be speaker. But you've also got strong leadership on Ukraine on the Democratic side. So regardless of the outcome of our congressional elections, the expectation is support for Ukraine will be very, very strong in the future, will remain intact.
It seems very reassuring, actually, to hear that, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers will appreciate, because there is a lot of uncertainty here in Europe concerning a potential Trump administration. But we are in an election year, and during the campaign, usually, well, a lot of things get said, and when it comes time to forming policy, things can change. The Supreme Commander here of U.S. forces in Europe, General Cavoli, said that right now that Ukraine's force generation depends on the EU and NATO, and that it's going to require us to generate and produce more equipment than we were contemplating perhaps 2 years ago. So could this be a good indicator of where we need to move on Ukraine, and that U.S. is going to be actively helping Ukraine defend itself?
Again, I think it's essential that the U.S. and Europe cooperate very closely via NATO to continue to produce arms, to send arms, to support Ukraine with what Ukraine needs to defend itself, and again, take the offensive. I mean, that's the goal. The good news is that the Ukrainian armed forces have driven the last Russian warship remaining in the Black Sea fleet out of the Black Sea. They've done this without having a navy. So it's testimony to the Ukrainians' resilience and their capability to take the offensive if they have the weapons that they need. With the news that F-16s are imminent, I think that this is going to be a critical change in the equation on the battlefield. The hope is Ukraine will get on the counteroffensive, will gain momentum in the fall. And again, I think that will add impetus to the effort to arm Ukraine further, both from the United States and from our European partners.
Going back to Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance, he did say something that many experts are saying currently, and that is the current administration, the Biden administration, lacks a key strategic goal or outcome for the war in Ukraine. Do you agree with that assessment? And do you agree that also Europeans lack the same resolve as far as our strategic outcome and what we want to achieve and how we want to achieve it in Ukraine?
Sure. I would make the case, the polling that my organization, the International Republican Institute, does in Ukraine, we do regular polling and share that with President Zelensky and his team. The polling indicates that the vast majority of Ukrainian citizens would like to see the result of this war being a return to the borders of 1991. That's clearly what the Ukrainian people want and expect. That's clearly the message from President Zelensky. So that really should be, I would hope, the policy of the United States, of Europe, of NATO, and the EU, a return to the borders of 1991, which means the complete withdrawal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. So again, this symbolic strategy, if you will, of standing with Ukraine as long as it takes is something I believe is difficult to define and difficult to understand. The policy really should be a complete withdrawal of Russian troops. We hope that that will be the case soon, and that's where our policy should be.
From one side, a complete withdrawal of Russian troops will probably take time. It's certainly in the current rate to wear down both the Russian economy and the Russian forces and Russian equipment losses. So do the two maybe come hand in hand? If our strategic outcome is the return to the 91 borders, this could take years to accomplish.
It could take some time. It's hard to predict, but the one thing that we have to do, we being the U.S. and Europe, continue to provide Ukraine with the weaponry that they need, allow them to use that weaponry to strike within Russia. It's vital that Ukraine be able to interdict all the supplies and troops that are massing on Russia's border. General Hodges came up with a great quote saying that we have to stop defending against the arrows that Russia is sending, and we have to be able to eliminate and kill the archer. In other words, we have to allow Ukraine to strike deep where the threat originates, and that's on the Russian side of the border. So again, continued weapons provisions, allowing Ukraine to strike deep. The F-16s in play, we think that could change the outcome on the battlefield rather quickly if those things happen. And again, I feel very confident of continued support in Ukraine. You mentioned remarks at the convention. IRI, my organization, sponsored an event in Milwaukee on the sidelines of the convention where a number of U.S. senators, our chairman, Senator Sullivan, Senator Ernst, others Lindsey Graham, who proclaimed strong support and continued military support of Ukraine. So I think that's the message emanating from our convention, strong congressional support for continued provision of weapons to Ukraine and also tightening sanctions against Russia.
Yes, Stephen Nix, International Republican Institute, thank you very much for those comments. We appreciate your analysis here on Ukraine this week. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Germany plans to cut in half its military funding for Ukraine in 2025. The country's finance minister, Christian Lindner, said the reason for the move is an increase in funding for Kyiv planned by the European Union. Others say that's just a matter of accounting within the German federal budget and nothing more, while admitting that the messaging is bad and untimely.
President Donald J. Trump.
The Republican National Convention wrapped up on Thursday, leaving European leaders even more anxious about future relations with the White House come January. Trump vowed to end the war in Ukraine but did not provide any details.
I will end every single international crisis that the current administration has created, including the horrible war with Russia and Ukraine, which would have never happened if I was president.
Trump also repeated his opinion that the U.S. cannot keep footing the bill for military aid to Ukraine. His running mate, J.D. Vance, has long been speaking out against sending costly military aid to Ukraine and opposed several aid packages.
I don't think spending another $61 billion of American money actually helps the Ukrainians that much because, again, our munition supplies are fundamentally depleted. There's only so much that we can do with additional dollars.
As President Biden is trailing in the polls, Ukraine and its allies must prepare for the possibility of a dramatic decrease in U.S. military aid once the new administration takes over. During an interview on the sidelines of the European Political Community Summit, President Zelensky spoke about working with J.D. Vance as Vice President of the United States if Trump is re-elected.
Maybe he really doesn't understand what goes on in Ukraine. So for us, we have to work with the United States. And if new team will come, we have to work with them. We need their support.
Kyiv's need for financial support is set to increase soon, after Germany announced that it would halve its military support in 2025. The EU has also been trying to smooth relations between Brussels and Washington. If Trump takes the White House, those transatlantic ties might undergo a significant shakeup.
And now I'd like to welcome to the program Mark McNamee, a co-founder at Ukraine Business News Network. Hello, and thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine this week.
Thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yes. Now, looking at the situation here in Europe, we had the European Political Community Summit in the UK not very long ago. And of course, leaders there are very concerned about a potential Trump administration, as well as dialing in a plan here in Europe to support Ukraine. Yet we hear this message coming out of Germany that they are going to cut spending for Ukraine in half next year. Some say, as I said in the intro, that it's not a big deal and it's just it's a matter of moving funds around in the German federal budget. But the messaging certainly is bad. So to get to my question now, Europe is going to have to come up with a strategy in the event of a Trump administration, and let's say that there are an abandonment of funding for Ukraine. Can Europe, in that event, step up and fund its own security and fund that of Ukraine's as well?
Just the direct answer is no. They cannot fund it insofar as providing the much required defensive needs, the weaponry in particular. On the financial side, the resources are there to provide the necessary funding to the budget to keep the Ukrainian government spending going, the economy going. But unfortunately, the EU simply doesn't have the military capacity at the current moment to fill that gap if we saw, as you're suggesting, a wholesale abandonment by the United States, let's say in about a year from now, after some of the policies take hold, and the supplemental bill is exhausted, let's say in next summer, out of the United States. Then, yes, then we have a pretty significant problem. That's, again, assuming a full abandonment by the United States, and then the EU would struggle not on the financial side, not on the humanitarian side, but they'd struggle on that provision of the defensive equipment and then direct results on the battlefield and more specifically in air defense over protecting not just the front lines, but over the rest of the country, the cities across the entire nation. So it'd be highly problematic, absolutely.
How is Ukraine viewing what we saw announced at the Republican National Convention over the week, Trump's pick of J.D. Vance to be the vice president? What's kind of the word on the street, if you will?
Much more concern. I've been based living in Kyiv here for nearly the last year, speaking with executives every day here on the ground, speaking with other researchers, economists, journalists, et cetera. And honestly, I'd say there's a bit of a turn really in the last couple of weeks, as there has been in Europe and in the United States, to be fair, where I know also from surveys we've done with our clients, the events we've held, talking to people here, there is some sort of optimism, maybe misplaced, but there was a lot of optimism that Biden would somehow win, right? That he despite what polling necessarily showed, there's a lot of optimism for some reason within Ukraine that Biden would win the election. With the debate, with the assassination attempt on Trump, with the current polling, now it seems that realism is setting in a little bit more, and there is much more concern, most definitely here on the ground, of a Trump presidency. And then with the J.D. Vance nomination as his vice president candidate, there's most definitely a lot more concern here. But to be honest, I don't think it's well appreciated what that can actually mean in the most extreme downside scenario, which even in a Trump J.D. Vance presidency, vice presidency, I actually don't tend to think we would see this full abandonment of Ukraine that obviously everyone is very concerned about, myself included. It's a possibility, but I still think a very low likelihood event to occur. But we need to prepare for it. It would be obviously extraordinarily high impact, not just for Ukraine, tragically for Ukraine at a humanitarian level, but for the entire Western order, for the United States itself, for Europe, for institutions like NATO and the EU, and what they look like afterwards. So it would be absolutely devastating, extraordinarily high impact, but I still tend to think quite low likelihood.
Right. It seems that President Zelensky is at least gearing up his administration to contemplate actually attempting to have some kind of peace talks after what Trump said in the debate. Obviously, they have to prepare for anything. And so I wonder what the feeling is about that, because if you look at the 10-point peace plan that President Zelensky has, and then if you look at what Russia says that it needs to even step to the table, I mean, we're worlds apart, obviously. So is there a little bit more, is that entered the conversation? Because I've also spent a significant time in Ukraine, and that was something that was a very stiff no to any kind of talks or even attempt to contemplate what they would mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, both sides, from the Kremlin's offering to Zelensky's peace proposals, they're both at complete. There's total non-starters. There's nothing to even work with here, to be perfectly honest. So, two things to mention. One is that any movements towards ceasefire talks, putting something on the table, some sort of proposal, some plans, at least set the groundwork, some foundation of something that we can start to work from at some point in the future as dynamics on the battlefield changes, as political developments occur, et cetera, over the coming, and we're talking about over the coming 6 months, year and a half, 2-3 years. So this is just very basically laying the groundwork. But I think more importantly, it's what audience are these officials speaking to, both Zelensky, Putin, Trump, Vance, et cetera. Mm-hmm. In the case of Zelensky, to answer your question, what is he doing here politically? He's speaking to a lot of audiences, but I think first and foremost, he is speaking to the far-right Western audiences. In the United States, of course, Trump, Vance, and the far-right MAGA crowd within the United States. But then also, we've seen the rise of populism across Western Europe. I mean, the Nigel Farage of UK and Le Pen and France, and the other, obviously, Orban and Fico and Slovakia, et cetera, going down the line. He is speaking to them to show that he's not a warmonger. He wants to. He's the first person to want this war to end. He's the one, as all Ukrainians are, suffering from Russia's invasion. So he wants to prove to them that, sure, I'm absolutely 100% interested in peace. And then he would love to try to expose Putin as being the one who is in reality, the true warmonger, the one who started this war, invaded a sovereign country, has continued the war, has now put his entire economy onto a war footing, built up the military massively, of course, and so is preparing for a long war. And so at a political level, Zelensky would love to expose that out of Putin and show to the West that I'm happy to try to end the war if we can, and demonstrate that from Zelensky's point of view, he cannot, because Putin will keep attacking and won't allow him to end the war. So it's, of course, there's political machinations going on here, a lot of political maneuvering, political signaling going on. But I think at this point, Zelensky wants to make sure he gets that message across, that he's not the one prolonging this war. He's not the one seeking an extension of this war. He's the one who wants to try to end it as soon as possible, and Putin is not the one who wants to end that. And you have to think, from Trump's point of view, he's the one who's trying to get this peace deal done, look like this global hero who ended this horrific war on the European continent. Zelensky can play to his interests there by showing him, sure, I'm ready for peace as well, and then expose Putin as the one who's not, and then he can get Trump on his side, ideally.
Yeah, it would be doubtful that Vladimir Putin will go to the table in good faith. Mark McNamee, co-founder, Ukraine Business News Network, thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine this week. We appreciate your thoughts.
Great. Thank you for the time.
And now joining me here on Ukraine this week is Brent Sadler, Senior Fellow at the Center for National Defense, the Heritage Foundation. Hello, sir, and thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine this week.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yes, now the Republican National Convention is now behind us. I think over here in Europe, everybody is scrambling to try and get a hold of who's going to win this election. I know there's still quite a lot that can happen in the next few months, and of course, other candidates that may arise out of the Democratic Party. But based on what you've seen over the past week at the Republican National Convention, where do you think we're headed down the road if Trump and J.D. Vance become elected and become next president and vice president of the United States?
Well, I mean, the first thing is I think a second Trump administration will be very much a continuation of the first one in many respects, and so therefore no real surprise. And again, rhetoric is only a part of what is a Trump administration. The actions are actually speaking louder than words. And so I would echo the concern in Europe and also in Asia of, things will change dramatically. Not necessarily true. And I would be surprised if anyone is surprised, because it's been very clear what Trump is. The selection of J.D. Vance as his vice president, who aligns very much with Trump's vision and also his thinking, I think is a bet where you're bringing in a very junior senator with not a lot of experience to come in and serve as a vice president. That's a long-term investment. So looking at potentially 12 years of a Republican administration, much like President Reagan leading into a President Bush.
Yes, interesting. So, and J.D. Vance, I mean, he's taken some stances that seem to have come out as very anti-Ukrainian, but I think if you look at the substance of what he's saying, he makes a point. One of the points that he's making is that the United States cannot be present everywhere. It can't take care of European security, the war in Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East all at the same time. Is that true, or is that just something that I understand that it's campaign season, and sometimes you say things to get votes, but is that really the truth? Should the United States kind of take a step back from Europe?
I don't think it's a question of should the United States. I think based on the dangers in Asia to the global, a world order of economic and diplomatic order that benefits European countries as much as it does the United States, it's an imperative that the United States needs to play a larger role in the Pacific if peace is going to be sustained there, to continue to deter China. And China's increasing aggressiveness makes that point that a reprioritization is necessary for the United States. Of course, at the same time, you don't want to open a void in Europe or the Middle East that the Russians or the Iranians then step right on in. And lack of leadership under President Biden has in effect created a void, an opening that Putin walked right into in 2022, and Iran through its proxies in 2023. So it's got to be done smartly, and nothing that I'm hearing coming from Trump and his actions would indicate that he's going to create a very irresponsible withdrawal like we saw under Biden in Afghanistan and Europe. And quite the contrary, I think what we'll see is a replay of the maximum pressure campaign early in his first administration with North Korea that resulted with him and Kim Jong-un building up a detente of sorts that ended ballistic missile testing and looked like it might actually turn the corner in a positive direction in what has been a very long, cold, and frozen conflict with the West versus North Korea.
Strategic goal and lack thereof, both here in Europe and within the Biden administration, that's something that experts have been citing for quite some time now as a major fundamental mistake here in this approach at the current time. Do you think that would be potentially remedied? That's something that J.D. Vance mentioned that is an absolute error on the current strategy, if you will. And is that what we're missing here? And that's why we continue to provide this piecemeal approach, kind of too little, too late?
Yeah, it's the same thing that we saw also in the Middle East versus the Houthis and Iran's proxies. There were months leading up to the attacks of October 7th where U.S. forces were being attacked and again sending the wrong signal. With regards to Ukraine and with China more broadly, I mean, absolutely, we need to actually double down on our investments in our military capabilities, and we need to have a strategy that actually gets ahead of Putin in Ukraine. And everything that we've seen coming out of D.C. under the Biden administration has been reactive and a complete misunderstanding of Putin's thinking and logic. And when we should have been sending and posturing military forces behind diplomatic speak in late 2021, we had quite the contrary, a withholding of any military posturing or delivery of forces to Ukraine to signal to Putin that there would be a higher cost than he was anticipating. Maybe we could have avoided. So there's still, even after going into 3 years, there still is not a clear strategy in the provision of munitions and equipment that would actually bring this to a conclusion. It is, of course, Ukraine's war to fight and win, but the support coming from Washington has not been guided by any serious strategy.
Which continues to be a major issue. Now, it is possible that this could be one of Donald Trump's biggest legacies. I mean, he only has 4 years, right? If he wins the election, he only has 4 years. And I would imagine that by defeating Russia, that would put him in the history books. He also mentioned during the debate, and I'd like to get your take on this, during the debate that he wants to try and end this war before he even becomes president. So between the election and between January 20th, he would like to put an end to this war and probably have the two sides sit down and talk. If Ukraine and Russia were to sit down and talk in November, is it likely that we'll have any kind of breakthrough? Or, as Donald Trump said, if they don't sit down and talk, then he will take sides?
Well, again, I go back to what he did with North Korea and early in his first administration and where that led to in a very positive situation. He's not going to be able to take any official actions. He's not going to be speaking for the U.S. government until he's inaugurated in January of 2025, if he's elected. But the threat and the rhetoric to Russia coming from what he intends to do, that's what I think Trump is talking about. That there will be a strong position. He's like, right now is the time. If you're going to make a deal, Putin, make it now, one that we can accept. If you don't, and I come in, I'm going to turn the heat up on you to compel you to make a deal. Again, it's a familiar playbook. If you look back to the experience with North Korea, and I think Putin understands that. We'll see. If both sides still have a lot of fight, that's Ukraine and Russia, and they still think they can get a more favorable outcome, then that could probably throw a monkey wrench into Trump's designs for a quick solution. But he already has a legacy of moving things forward, and with North Korea, he also has a legacy that he can build on with the Abraham Accords that have been very successful in getting recognition and security for Israel. And that is one of the reasons why Iran acted the way they did in instigating Hamas to attack on October 7th last year.
If indeed there is going to be a Trump administration, Ukraine will have to accomplish several things. They're not in the best position to negotiate at the moment. So between now and November, what does Ukraine need to do to get in a good position to be able to sit down at the table?
Well, because of bad decisions and very tardy support coming from Washington, D.C. specifically, but also NATO partner countries as well to help Ukraine for a quicker solution on the battlefield, I think the future is going to have to be from the sea. And I've said this for well over a year and a half, that holding Crimea at risk, cutting it off from its supplies and threatening it, is the only way to really get Putin's attention at this stage of the war. And so if Ukraine can do that effectively, severing the Kerch Strait, holding shipping at risk with its very effective use of unmanned drones, it actually imperils perhaps the most prized possession of Russia's annexed territory in Ukraine to date. And that's the only way I think that Ukraine brings Putin to the table in a meaningful way, other than the threat of additional and much more rapid military assistance from the United States.
Okay, well, Brent Sadler, Senior Fellow, Center for National Defense, the Heritage Foundation, thank you very much for your insight and your analysis. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And that's all on this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for another summary of all the week's most important events happening in Ukraine. My name's Don Arla. Thanks for watching, and see you again next time.